When adding details to the underside of the Transtar 4300 hood, I reworked the hood hinges, and initially I was quite pleased with the results, using brass tube for bushings inside the styrene tube hinges. I did locate them farther back on the frame than they are on the stock kit, as can be seen here by looking at an unmodified kit frame rail. I didn't think this would cause any issues. I simply mocked up the cabin hood in the proper position, measured the difference between the hinge locations, and bent 3/64 brass wire to suit. I even soldered brass tube collars in place to ensure proper alignment when the model was reassembled after test fitting, and added another piece of brass tube in between the frame rails to replicate the appearance of the real truck's hood hinge. Everything was fine until work began on the radiator, and with this subassembly in place, I wanted to install the hood to check for fit. Then I discovered that the bottom radiator tank was occupying the same space that the hood hinge bars and crosser tube were. I hadn't test fitted the rad when creating the hood hinges, and didn't think about the radiator and tank extending down below the frame rails. I considered omitting the crosser tube and cutting off the hinge bar short as shown here, but decided instead to rework the hinges to keep them looking more like the prototype truck. First step was drilling out the bushings with a 1/16 drill. Because these were glued in place, they're in there pretty solid. Hinge was rough cut away from the outside of the frame. Remainder of hinge material was cut away with a chisel blade and a hobby knife, and the old holes for the bushings were filled with 1/16 styrene rod glued in place. And sometimes the chisel blade does slip and take out details that you didn't want to remove, in this case one of the molded on bolt heads for the bottom radiator support. Enough of the bolt head remained to locate a hole, which was drilled to take 30 thou styrene rod, which was glued in place, set at the same projection as the rest of the molded in bolt heads. Although it's round and not hex, the appearance is convincing enough once glued in place and under a finished coat of paint. Now that we're back to intact frame rails free of holes, the frame portion of the hinge is created using 1/8 styrene tube with a bushing set inside made from 1/16 thin wall brass tube. Wall thickness on this tube is 6/1000 of an inch, which makes for a perfect fit on 3/64 brass rod used for the hinge bars. Notches are filed in the front of the frame rails, and the tubes are glued in place using a piece of 3/64 brass rod as an alignment tool. Cab and hood are temporarily assembled using masking tape, and this subassembly is in turn secured to the frame. With one hinge tube on the hood and another on the frame, 3/64 brass rod is bent to connect the two pieces. A 90-degree bend is made first, one leg is placed in the frame hinge tube, and then the required bend is made as shown here to align the vertical leg with the tube on the hood. Once everything is fitted properly, mark the hinge bars in the appropriate locations and solder small collars on made from the same thin wall brass tube that was used for the hinge bushings. These collars ensure proper alignment every time the hood is reinstalled, and combined with the precise fit of the brass rod in the brass bushings, make it possible to remove and reinstall the hood as many times as required for test fitting, painting, masking, or any other reasons. A styrene disc and a bolt head casting were glued to the top of the hood hinge tube to replicate the adjusting bolt visible on the prototype hinge. Online for sale ads for complete trucks or individual parts can be a great source of prototype information, and this example is from a Transtar 4300 hood that was for sale. It's a good overall view of the hinge assembly, showing the adjusting nut on the top of the hinge tube on the hood, the offset bend required to set the hood in the proper location, and how the hinge bar goes right across in front of the radiator tank. A little bit more planning ahead and some test fitting of the radiator before creating the original hood hinge certainly would have saved the need for all this rework, but in the end, I'm glad I did take the time to rework the project, because a side benefit is a finished hinge that looks closer to the prototype than the first version. Kind of a lemonade for lemon situation. Thanks for watching this little bit of corrective rework, and if any modeling mistakes happen on one of your projects, don't be afraid to go back and rework it and make it the way you want it.